Hello, hello. Oh. Hi, everybody. We're going to play a game of musical chairs because I know what this feels like because I do it myself, which is you always leave the front row open. But we're very excited to announce there are no VIPs here. And you're all the VIPs. So please come and join us in the front. This is a session that will be very open and you can grill every one of the participants. So all of the folks in the back, feel free to take some of these front rows. And we'll get started in exactly 30 seconds. Who is this? I don't know, actually. Yeah, we should... No, you don't need this. Actually, I think there might be a... Move this forward. Where are you sitting? I want to sit on the side. So you take this one.
Hello?
Because I'll moderate. Does everyone have a... Yeah.
Almost gonna fall off.
Time for acapella. All right. Welcome, everyone. I think this is known as the sort of the penultimate session at Davos because I think we've all had a long week, and thank you for joining us. My name is Gaurav Gupta. I'm the global managing director of a company called Dalberg Advisors. We are folks who do a lot of advisory work with one sort of core mission, which is we help our clients advance a social impact agenda. So that's a little bit about us. And we've put together this panel, and I actually want to spend a little bit of time talking about why we construct... Oh, hello. Nice to see you. Sorry, ex-Dalbergian. Why we constructed this panel. So a lot of our work over the last 25 years has been looking at how do you help governments, NGOs make social impact. We've recognized in each of these spaces, the private sector plays an overwhelmingly larger part, and that has only grown. And many of you in the audience will be very familiar with all of the work that is being done around the world to work on helping private sector organizations do more impact. The pace of that has been remarkably slow. And so we thought we would throw a provocative question out there that just kind of says, what would it take for, instead of this constant use of the word, let's grow social enterprises, to actually ask the question, what would it take for companies to become social enterprises? So we're asking this company this question in a slightly reverse way. And that is the reason why we've chosen this fantastic set of folks. I will introduce them in turn as we speak, but just to say we have philanthropists who I think need to think about how their dollars can also get the private sector dollar to act in a more impactful way. We have actual social entrepreneurs who can talk about why their model works as a social enterprise and what would happen if they weren't a social enterprise. We have investors who I think are going to bring a dose of reality to sometimes my softer nature. Right? And we have people who have worked both actually in companies where they've had to face hard-nosed decisions alongside what they really want to do as in their companies, and often jumping onto the other side as being part of foundations now as well. So it's a fantastic mix of this whole problem from a 360-degree angle. So that's what that's the journey we're going to go on. There will be time for many of your questions, as long as they're short. So let me actually kick it off by, since we use this word social enterprise, it is a term that there are many definitions of, and if anyone has heard Muhammad Yunus speak, there's certainly a very edge version of it versus how perhaps mainstream is using it. So I'm actually going to start with with Akshay, who was this year's Social Entrepreneur of the Year, thanks to Schwab. So a round of applause. It's fantastic. Thank you for joining us. He'll tell you a little bit why it's such a richly deserved award. But actually, what I want to know is, so you are a social entrepreneur, and if you take your business and you now conceptualize it as a non-social entrepreneur business, what would be different about it? Like, what is the mainstream version of your social enterprise business, and why is it that there is even this tag? Why can you not scale to what you need to be, continuing to emphasize the social aspects of your business model?
Yeah, so we run the country's largest free test preparation program. So
The country is India.
The country is India, yeah.
Not Switzerland.
Not Switzerland, yeah. India's largest test preparation program. So we work with almost 100,000 children, help them prepare for, in grade 11 and 12 for engineering, medical entrance exams, because India, everything is gated by a test. And I think in our case, actually, it's very clear what the alternative is. So we have a $7 billion test preparation industry just for these exams in India. Most of them cater to the top 2% or 3% of the income pyramid. And the reason they don't expand is because there aren't that many seats, right? So what's happened, and this has happened with test preparation, I think, globally, which is that over the years, the price has gone up and the demand has also gone up. It's very price inelastic. So over the decades, what's actually happened is that the quality of these programs commercially has gotten better and better and better and more intensive. And the price has gone higher. Thereby, there is now a chasm, right? Which means that kids who don't have, and this is not even low income, but any kids who are middle to low income represent less than 2% of graduates from top tier colleges. So when we started, and we've done actually both ways. So we've always done the same thing, which is we've helped find low income kids and prepare them for these exams. I think in the early years, we had a revenue model. So we would try and charge them and run services that were affordable. We realized very quickly that providing low fidelity services at low prices is just not a model that works, especially when there's a well-established industry, right? So you have to provide then high fidelity models at low prices, and unless there's a huge technology component or a differentiator in that way, it's very, very hard to do that. So I think about 6 or 7 years into our journey, we decided to stop trying to charge money, and we became completely open source and fully charity funded. The only difference being that in the Indian context, there is almost $3 billion available to access because we have a law which mandates that 2% of all corporate profits have to be donated to charity. So what it's actually done is many folk have done what we did, which is that many people realize that you can actually access tens of hundreds of millions of dollars actually if you wanted to from CSR. But to answer Gaurav's question specifically, what it would look like is you would want to have lower margins, right? Because education and health often are service delivery businesses. And if you're going to deliver high quality services in the absence of a lot of technology, it is going to cost money. So the only way that if a large corporation that is doing test preparation and making 30% net profit is going to be a social enterprise is they're willing to let in a large number of children on scholarship or cross-subsidize, which hospitals in India have done. But it requires a lot of intent. And for us, I think because of this, and I don't think I've found a solution. So I think what our solution right now is to work with the most disadvantaged with charitable dollars and then unlock government spending for the rest of the kids. And we're trying to create a market. We're trying to make markets where commercial-minded players can come and play, serving the same children. I don't know if that answer is going to work. We'll try. But maybe.
Yeah, and even the example you used of hospitals, that's actually mandated, right? So it's not that hospitals are doing it as part of a natural incentive. There's actually a mandate which to get the license. And I think that's what we're going to try and really look at is, okay, so what are strategies around it to get businesses to do something that currently they don't seem to have the incentives? And Ahmed, I want to bring you in here as the CEO of Emirates Foundation. Now, foundations traditionally would look at supporting Akshay, and you should support Akshay, because as you can see, that his scale is literally limited by philanthropic dollars, right? At the same time, just the leverage of getting some of those big companies, and UAE is growing very fast, getting them to behave is a strong word. Strike that from the record, please. But getting them to sort of take on some of these challenges, huge leverage in that. Have you been exploring this? Is that a hard thing for foundations to come to grips with?
So I think in the context of maybe growing some social enterprises, you always face a ceiling. So even if you do some profits, that can sustain you as a social enterprise, you'll stay stagnant. You won't grow, and ultimately these complex challenges and opportunities won't move fast as much as we want it to. So ultimately, this is where we started noticing that each sector, whether it's the public or private, has a role to play. So even if the social enterprises, or even the third sector, so the NGOs, the NPOs, you name it, come in and try to take it upon themselves to move either the SDG goals, some of the priorities for any nation, they will always face the scale-up challenge. So how do you start incentivizing or changing some of the ways the both sectors, the public and private sector, can contribute in, and instead of just shouldering everything on this third sector, that they also help in a form or another, not just by writing a paycheck at the end of the day. Sometimes you need to roll up your sleeve and get into the mud, as they say. So some methods that we started to notice might work is something called the purposeful procurement. Can they start procuring from social enterprises? Can they forecast, the demand so the supply can catch up? And we had some great methods in the UAE, and one maybe a quick example that actually was inspiring for me even way before the foundation was a very small social enterprise called Ghadir, and it employs women that elderly women in rural areas that do traditional handcrafts. And they developed products that ultimately landed in Etihad Airlines, one of the largest airlines in the world. Now, that also had a bit of hand-holding and coaching from the private sector, because if you want to supply small bags to every airplane, that orders will come in for hundreds of thousands of units. So how do you take a small social enterprise and make it ready to meet the demand? And I think this success story inspired many other private sector entities to think the same about many other topics, whether it's food loss and waste, whether it's circularity, textile, plastics, you name it. Education is the same thing. Sometimes, you have expertise that sit within both the private and public sector. Can they come in? Can they volunteer rather than just, shouldering or relying just on these social entrepreneurs or these foundations to do the work for them. So I think there's a recipe, but we'd like to see more. And especially engagement is the key. Now it can be from, as I mentioned, procurement, up to individuals, up to policies, up to more investment in some of these topics.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're reminding me of something my mom said. Lots of moms say this, I think. Which is, you are what you eat. And I think what you're saying is one way to turn corporates into social enterprises is get them to buy from social enterprises, right? And especially at scale, this has. So I think that's one strategy. Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you about some of these tensions, though, because you've seen both sides of this coin, right? And maybe if you can talk through the role you had previously at Novartis around thinking about business for good, and then now at the foundation. How do you see these pressures from the business side, right? That where everyone's asking, I'm sure there are people saying, can you change your procurement? Can you think about supporting doing business in a different way? And what's that conversation that happens inside business when these things happen?
So I want to touch on 2 points. The first is, first of all, I represent the Novartis Foundation. We focus on improving population health and reducing health inequities at large. Right now, we are focused on leveraging data, tech, and AI, primarily in data-rich contexts, and how to explore how we can integrate that into low and middle income settings. I've had a completely different experience where we've learned how to ensure that it's not mutually exclusive, that social business can be integrated into a corporate enterprise, that you can appeal through shared values, shared outcomes that you're seeking to achieve. So I'll give one example. So one of our programs, Sao Paulo, and it's a population health program focused on reducing cardiovascular risk across the population. In 15 months of implementation, working across different sectors in workplace associations, food trucks, we identified food deserts and worked with food associations and farmers to supply healthy food. We managed to reduce cardiovascular risk and stroke incidence by 12%. This is not in just one setting. So we've attracted funding from insurance companies. One example is Swiss Re they are interested in not only the social impact that they can see, but actually what it has on their cost savings over time, because it actually affects their bottom line.
Yeah, so you're talking about this sort of shared value space, and I'm going to come back to how big is that space, because I think there are a lot of examples, but does it really get swamped by the not shared value space, right? So I'll give you time to think about that, because I want to bring Ola in here, because there's a lot of pressure at times as an investor, and an investor with some mouth-watering returns. Just be clear. You've seen at this idea of impact investing. Most of your investments are in Africa. That seems to have this halo of, well, everything you do in Africa should be about impact and so forth. But as a hard-nosed investor, do you see there's a role for... that's a compliment from me. Do you see a role for investment to be, or investors to be driving businesses to have social outcomes?
So I think there needs to be a strategic differentiation between the way impact is seen in rich countries and the way that impact is seen in poorer countries. So I live in Nigeria. We have the highest number of poor people in the world, so people living below the poverty line in the world. When we go to South Africa, for instance, it's the most unequal country in the world. The Gini coefficient is the highest in the world. When we go to Egypt, there's similar social problems. When we go to Nairobi, of course, the biggest slum in the world is in Nairobi. So I think that a lot of the African investment ecosystem has probably over-indexed on impact. And when I go to Western countries, I think perhaps, without wanting to be offensive, perhaps have under-indexed on impact, and in fact are rolling back impact initiatives, are talking less about the climate, are talking less about gender, thinking less about equality, when they probably have the economic base to do so. However, when I look at Africa right now, and the geopolitical environment, where there's been big scale backs in the WHO, for example, big scale backs in international aid. I think that this is a time when Africa has to be focused on economic returns and building profitable, big, sustainable businesses. I think that the only way that NGOs or non-profits get any money is from profit-making companies. So I think that impact should be at the heart of what we do as human beings, but then there has to be a strategic differentiation between what's Tesla or Amazon or Google would do in the social impact space and what I would be advising entrepreneurs in Nigeria or South Africa or Kenya who need to create jobs, who need to increase their GDP per capita, who need to even develop the basic infrastructure and business know-how to contribute to the world in a meaningful way to do right now.
I mean, I love the dichotomy you used about thinking about impact differently in different settings. And by the way, I mean, this, as you know, even ESG, forget impact investing, even ESG is being rolled back at the moment. And the alternative to this panel is you can actually watch Trump right now addressing WEF. He's doing it online. But let me just actually come back to you on this, which is, as an investor, there's this notion of market returns. And one argument, and I'm not saying I make this argument, but one argument is, well, the notion of market returns is itself nonsensical. When we say what is market returns, it is actually because there's tons of hidden costs that have been socialized. And why should Africa be making those mistakes that everyone else is making in a chase for what we might term market returns? Now, what would you say to that person?
Oh, I love this idea. I think it's beautiful. I think it's like the ideal world that I would love to live in. I think that's the ideal world that everybody in the audience would love to live in. But the truth is, I do an economic outlook every year. I'm just finishing my PhD in finance, so I try and use econometric models to look at, what the economy in the year is going to bring. And if inflation goes up in America, which it probably will do because tariffs are inflationary, deportation is inflationary, then the risk-free rate in America goes up to 5%, which means that almost every African country is locked out of the financial markets. I can remember, like, somebody asked me, like, why isn't Nigeria going to the market to raise money? And I said that America is 5%. Turkey is struggling to raise at 9%. So what do you want Nigeria to raise at? 20%? Like, we're effectively locked out of the market because simply America raised interest rates. So there is a notion of the risk-free rate. And whatever the rate is in America, we have to give a better return than that rate to be able to raise capital. And sometimes it's just not possible to do that. So I love the notion of, you know, the fact that the market rate doesn't take into consideration these externalities. A lot of the things, like America right now is producing 13 million barrels of oil per day. There's obviously externalities to that are being socialized or not being socialized, they're just being kicked down the line. So I do think there's massive externalities that are ignored when we think about profit only. But unfortunately, we live in a world where I can't raise capital unless I give a better return than an American fund gives. Right. My business will not be scalable unless I invest in African businesses that giving a better return, because that's all that will make an investor leave Silicon Valley, leave Kentucky, leave New York, leave Boston, and come to Nigeria. Far, not even Europe. I need to be giving a much better return. This is the only reason. I cannot go to them and say, you know, I need this for only the impact that I'm making, especially in this geopolitical environment where it is, you know, there's been a rollback in a lot of these social impact metrics. I do, like, going back to your question, I do really sort of relate to the point you made about market returns and this concept of the way that the world has been structured in terms of the capital markets just being really unfair to the most disadvantaged in society. And again, kicking things down the road and not incorporating externalities. And I hope, you know, one day that we can change that.
I think that deserves a round of applause. Let's just take a pause. Let's just take a pause. I promised we would get real answers. And actually,
I don't actually deal with market returns. I deal with human returns, but they have a very real economic benefit from productivity, working with workplace associations. They're invested in prioritizing human dignity and for those that are most marginalized. And so I agree that there needs to be that focus, but in my perspective, from the experience that I've had, I truly believe that there is also a cost of doing business, and that cost is very real, both when you're working in the business or at the foundation. From the business side, yes, there needs to be incentives in place, from public commitments to ethical senior leadership that can support and give you a mandate to work for common good. But in my experience, you can actually, when you move from reactive sick systems, as Ahmed also says, towards really proactive, predictive, and ultimately preventative health systems that keep people healthy, you can actually save money for those in the long term.
Yeah, and I think this is, I'm going to bring that question for the whole panelists around how do you pay for these things that are socialized costs, right, at the moment. And there's always an incentive to socialize those costs. Actually, I want to come to you, Ahmed, on this. When we talk about even this idea that Ola raised around the pressures you feel as well from that market system, actually we don't have a uniform market system in the world. There is a different form of even the nature of capitalism in Europe than there is in the US. There's, one would argue, although there's also ample evidence. Otherwise, there's more stakeholder capital in Europe versus the idea in the US that really your investor is everything and is not necessarily about your customer and your employees as much. The UAE is in a huge building mode. It is thinking through large businesses. It is investing as a philanthropic hub. That's something you're very much part of. You're reimagining a lot of things. Is there, do you think, a different notion, or maybe a UAE notion, of the role of business and the responsibility of business?
I think, just to answer your question, I would say to start with defining what's their role could be or what would it be is first to bridge the gap on understanding. So allow me to maybe be a bit more blunt, is that sometimes they look at some of these social causes and they look at the people looking at it, working on it as tree huggers. You know, we'll fund them, we'll support them and what sort, they'll do their thing. And they don't see the possibilities, even from a business perspective. So maybe let me double click on health. Health is a big industry worldwide. And moving from, a reactive healthcare system to a proactive health system or a preventative healthcare system, someone might say, what's in it for us? We're going to lose money. It's less people coming to the hospital, less money, less people getting prescribed medicine and what sort. But on the contrary, if you see the potential of how that can become income generating also and a win-win situation for everyone, that's where the education comes into play. What are the possibilities in these causes that can uplift some of the, I would say, work that happens in the private sector? And then they come in on the table as partners, as people that are well invested in this win-win situation, and they follow through. So again, just to give example on health, moving from this reactive, mindset to longevity, preaching about biomarkers, health tech, AI in healthcare. How can you start hacking your body and what sort? And that by itself is $1 billion industry. So again, it's not that you're losing or you're trying to shy away from these causes. So when private sector understands this and actually sees some of the grassroots elements and some of the grassroots challenges and where they could come into play, this is where I think this lens of social entrepreneurship can be embedded within their greater strategy. And I think that's what we've been doing in the UAE.
So one of your arguments here is that actually one of the ways we can think about pushing more corporates to act more socially is to increase the information available to them about the opportunities, that there is an actual information divide. You were about to come in. I wonder if you agree with that.
Just on the subject of the UAE and maybe changing the system a bit. Last year at Milken, the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, I think his name is Kaloum, he had a very, very interesting perspective, which was very different from the US perspective. And what he said was he understands that there's a rollback in investment from the US. He understands that there's, some people are calling it the end of globalization. Some people are calling it deglobalization. And he said that the UAE isn't interested in that they're going to continue to invest, that there are more people under the age of 21 in India than the whole US population. And that's why he sees the opportunity during this rollback to keep on investing in these countries. So we might be seeing a shift in sort of the flows of global capital and the way global capital is allocated, simply because there are new players in town with lots of money that are just doing things differently and maybe doing things that are more focused on that double bottom line of profit and impact than the previous sort of system of the financial markets. So I do think that there's a chance that we might see sort of a different kind of capitalism. And I can remember the flyers. I can remember the, the billboards. It said Abu Dhabi, the capital of capital. America does not call itself that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an incredibly important point to say that capitalism has a culture and that there are different cultures of capitalism. And I think there's therefore an opportunity. So I'm going to summarize what I've heard and I'm going to give that to you, Akshay, to deal with, right? So far, 4 strategies seem to have emerged from what folks have said on does every corporate, how do you make corporates into social enterprises, right? I've heard the following.
Yeah. I thought you made a slide already.
Yeah. Just popped up. I think it's the wrong title, but okay. One is this idea of let's get them to procure better. So the actual inputs coming into the organization are coming from fantastic, socially responsible things. And I think that's great. There's a role of shared value, and there's many places where you can get the incentives right. I love the point. Some places you just got to make some damn profit and grow things, right? And get a vibrant economy going. Absolutely. And I think this idea of increasing information, sometimes there are information gaps on where it is to do the right thing. And then I think finally we talked about, with this new population, perhaps there's an opportunity for a new culture of capitalism. You're a social enterprise. You've seen the hard edges of this. Do you believe any of this? Is it going to work?
I don't think it'll work the way it is today. Partly, and to Ola's question, right? Like in India has the same issue. We have high inflation and the US interest rate, which means if you're not generating 28% IRR, no one is interested. I don't even think our commercial businesses generate 28% IRR, valuation ignored. But I do think there's an opportunity to build coalitions and build somewhat local coalitions, because I think the socio-economic environment, as Ola was mentioning, in India versus Nigeria is going to be quite different. And I think the role of a charity and the role of an investor and the role of a corporation are going to be quite different. And India has actually done that a few times well. I don't know if by thought or by accident, but like if you look at our IT sector, we had massive special economic zones, we had huge tax subsidies, we had massive incentives from the government to build colleges. So we created like student supply, youth supply, and we kind of nailed it, right? As India, look at the pavilions, right? We haven't managed to do that again. And I think part of the problem, and to bring that out, is charity.
Sorry, say more? The part of the problem is charity?
I think because, while we can throw bricks at everything else, I think part of the way that we think about charity is also problematic, right? Which is that we are not, as charitable organizations, going to solve the problem by ourselves. It's just not going to happen. Especially in countries like India, where the scale is so large. I'll point the finger at myself a little bit, right? Which is to say, we have almost 15 million young people graduating high school. We generate 500,000 jobs, regular jobs, right? So for me to say Avanti is going to solve this problem means I need to be a $250 million nonprofit, which can be an aspiration, but that's a little crazy. And I do think that many of us, and me included, I think it's taken us a lot of time to realize that's not going to happen. And we will have to deal a little bit with the unsavoriness of the way large corporations function, right? From our lens. Like if you take a very purist, social good lens, in many ways, profit making, kicking someone out because they can't pay fees, focusing on kids who are going to get you better marketing material looks unsavory, but that's just how business runs. And I think finding a way where we can make peace a little bit with the inconsistencies and the conflict, but actually build a coalition where you use a combination of regulation, which is, I think, the hammer, right? Forced action, charitable giving, which plays an incredibly important role in innovation, especially social innovation, demonstrating models, showing that they can work, building coalitions, and money making. Like you have to do all three to solve problems. And I think it's important that we build coalitions and we stop kind of working a little bit in silos.
All right. You're breaking my heart a little bit because the title here was how do you get corporates to be more like you? And you're like, how can I be more like a corporate? But okay. But I want you to ponder, I'll come back to you on it, but I want you to ponder therefore, as you want to increase the amount of also charitable and philanthropic capital, what you think about the Indian 2% mandate. Is that something for the world to mimic? But Elizabeth, I said I would come back to you about this question. I know you want to come in on this as well, but also if you could answer this question, shared value. It's been used a lot. Porter's made his second name on it and so forth. But how big is the space of shared value versus the space of value for the company and a select set of customers only, and let's not pay our fair share? Like, I agree there's shared value, but how big is it really?
I think I've spoken about this with, identifying joint commitments that you can really act toward. So, for instance, Swiss Re, which, is an investor of many of our population health programs, we have found a shared, possible outcome that we want to see, and they will invest in that. And so I think that there are other examples of that. We work hand in hand with local governments. The priority there is their priority. We work with local accountability, local ownership, local coalitions, because the priorities that they set for their communities are the communities that we serve. And so ultimately, we have to align ourselves to their priority. So I do think there's a possibility, but what I wanted to respond to actually is based on a multitude of efforts. We have seen that. I think you're forgetting one important part about charitable giving, and that's risk taking. And the Novartis Foundation, we are able to take more transformative approaches towards health system transformation. We focus on systemic root causes and sort of think tank work because it's a foundation. And when we are in the business, we are, and actually many of our initiatives have gone from an idea, something really transformative and powerful, and with robust impact measurement, have been able to scale it and actually been rolled out into the business for long-term growth. So one of the examples is actually one of our AI for leprosy programs, and that has moved into the social business side of Novartis because it was so impactful for the business.
Oh, super interesting example. Can you just say a little bit more about that one?
So we partnered with Microsoft AI for Good, which is the philanthropic arm of Microsoft, and developed a early detection mechanism for leprosy. This was actually before my time, but I've seen it grow into the global health side of the business, which is a sustainable business strategy of Novartis.
Gaurav, how about we ask you a question? So we know Dalberg is a social enterprise. How do you make it work?
Well, making it work is a strong statement. Okay, I mean, I think here's what I would say. I think the strategy we use, so advisory services is traditionally a profit maximization model, like any other model. Just so folks know, we're a social enterprise in the sense that our brand is actually sitting inside an NGO. We are legal in a sort of legal or governance way mandated not to be profit maximizing, but we can be profit seeking. And that the reason we're not profit maximizing is we can only work on certain types of issues, and those issues, when I say only, they actually cover the globe, which is that we can only work on things that are for the public good. So that's what I guess makes it a social enterprise, and it is hard because you're often turning down opportunities and clients that earn you a certain amount of margin that allows you to grow. I think what makes it work is the reality of companies is that companies are made up of individuals that see themselves as professionals. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how do you change the nature of how each of you see yourself as a professional? So here's the example I always use is a doctor, signs onto a Hippocratic oath. So suddenly if you put 10 doctors together and say it's a company, does that company become profit maximizing? Because an individual doctor is not profit maximizing, and they're not allowed to be. And so technically the answer is no. You can't. And I think there's a noble version of every profession. And I think the only reason you expect doctors and journalists and lawyers to sign on to these sort of code of conducts, but not a consultant and not a coder, for example, is actually historical anachronism. Actually, a coder today is deciding your life outcomes much more than your medical practitioner. Mm-hmm. They are deciding what's fair in society by the algorithms they write, and who gets prioritized and what is the objective function of their code. Consultants are working behind the scenes, I am one of them, to figure out who gets fired, who gets served, who gets funded. These are life-changing things for many people. The fact that we don't have a code, or at least society doesn't seem to expect us to have a code beyond do what's right for your client, I think is insane. So the way Dalberg works is we hire people that have a code. And for them, we're able to therefore pay decently, but then no one is expecting us to maximize their outcomes on salary. But man, do I feel an enormous amount of pressure to meet their code. It's actually really hard. What is the most difficult conversations I have inside my company is when people say, why did we do this piece of work? That's my hardest conversation, not my bottom line. So I think it's hard. And I think one of the things I face the same thing, Akshay, is what's the capital that we can have to increase our size? And it's harder because we don't want to take private equity capital, right? Yeah. For those very reasons. Thank you for asking this question. Well, I wanted to come back to something that I thought you beautifully put, which is, you're trying to raise money. And when you try to, I've spoken to a bunch of people in investment in Africa. You have to be better than everybody else, like seriously better, because people perceive an enormous amount of risk. So at one level, there's an a perception of risk in investing in Africa, which means the bar is higher. On the other side, there are people who are like, yeah, but I also want to see you create impact. And I really loved Ahmed's point, which is actually people maybe just need to be educated on what is impact. Are you caught in the middle there? Is that the challenge? Or are you able to demonstrate that, hey, it's low risk and frankly making profit is making impact in the part of the world that you're working in?
So in terms of our portfolio now, we feel that by investing in the best companies in Africa, we're making impact, right? 50% of our portfolio is female, or has one female founder. And Africa is the only continent in the world where a woman is more likely to start a business than a man. So it makes sense that like a lot of our portfolio companies would be led by women. When we think about healthcare outcomes and the ability of Africa to perhaps improve the lives of people on a continent with the highest maternal mortality rate in the world, Nigeria has the highest child mortality in the world. You're 7 times more likely to die as a result of a traumatic car accident in Nigeria than you are in the UK. So looking at those outcomes and, funding innovators that are working in those spaces, I think is a huge outcome. So a huge impact. So one of the things that we measure is number of lives touched by their healthcare innovations, and we also measure the cost compared to the median cost that you would get it on the market, and that's one of our impact measurements. And when we think about financial inclusion, I think that this is one area actually where Nigeria in particular, not being biased, has a comparative and competitive advantage. 70% of the world's mobile money transactions occur in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, I realize that I'm in Europe, so I will try to be a bit tactful about this. But when you consider, like most countries in Europe, the per capita venture capital is $1,000. And when you think about Nigeria, the per capita venture capital is $1 or $2, but we're still producing unicorns at the same rate as the UK. There's an arbitrage opportunity and an obvious competitive advantage in technology. And that technology, both in financial services and in healthcare, doesn't only benefit Africans, it benefits the world. And I'll give you a story of one of the best performing health techs in Africa. It's a company that uses AI for drug discovery, and that was bought by Moderna for $1 billion. But it was funded initially by local venture capitalists like me. So when it was bought for $1 billion, obviously that capital was recycled into the ecosystem. That money is now funding a new set of founders. But also, now the technology is actually, saving lives across the world, being acquired by a global pharmaceutical company. So I feel the pressure to sort of report on impact as sort of granularly as I report on financial outcomes. But I also feel that in Africa, profit is impact, jobs are impact, and of course, innovation is impact.
Amazing. I'm going to open this up to the audience, and then we'll come back and do a bit of a round. Sorry, actually, were you coming in on? Please.
No, I was just going to add there that is all
That's
impact, but then there's also other impact which I think commercial models don't cover. And I think that the stress is actually how do you get, because there are things which innovation, high-risk innovation.
Market failures.
Market failures. I think that term is a little messy, but I think there's forms of impact where it may not be solved through technical innovation. And I think that's where we start to struggle a little bit with.
Great point, Akshay. So we're going to open up to some questions. The way I'll do it is I might take 2 or 3. And depending on the quality of the question, we will allocate time. Okay, so the pressure is on. So please be quick, and please do let us know your name and organization.
Thank you so much.
It's on.
My question is that when I listen to the conversation, so I noticed that given to the increasing of alignment between social impact outcomes and corporate strategies here, so what are the key challenges, or I can say trade-offs, corporation face one transaction between two social enterprises model, or how can businesses balance between the process of short-term shareholders' returns with the long-term commitment required for social impact or social investment.
You brought in the time angle. I think we'll talk about that. We'll take 2 more questions. That's great. Over here.
Temba Mkwanazi from Anglo American. First and foremost, would just like to congratulate the panel, made up of young people, and it's really inspiring.
I'm not young, but I guess you mean the rest of them.
For a dinosaur like me, you know, it gives us a lot of hope. So thank you very much. I guess my question is probably more around the paradox or the contradiction that talks to how narrow you define what you talk about as social enterprise, and this paradox of regulating, forcing people to give, as a corporates, I should say, as opposed to allowing them to give freely. Because, you know, when you think about it in the context of, you know, social enterprise, I mean, corporates are becoming more powerful. In many cases, their value is 3 times the GDPs of sovereign countries. All of our lives are very much determined by the products that they provide. So, but they pay minimal tax. I mean, they hire hordes and hordes of people. So should social responsibility not also talk to, if you're socially responsible, you have to pay your fair way of tax. You can't be forcing, you know, maximization of profits, because the social element is a fraction of the bigger money. So how broad should we be in terms of definition, and how should we be balancing the regulation versus the free giving?
I love that question. And let's just take one more. Honey, we'll go over here and then. Oh,
Sorry. Just super fast, because thank you for the great presentation. I was mostly interested in the perspective that you were complementing from like a consulting company, and like the Dahlberg's perspective, mostly like you were talking about like an ethics code and how that affects, negatively impacts startups, because of course profit maximization versus profit seeking. To what extent could you elaborate more on like what type of investments you normally reject, or you say, okay, because of our values, because of what we don't believe in, we're going to reject this source of money, which could be life-saving for my project, right? Like, because as an entrepreneur, of course, you need to subsist in order to continue doing the impact. And of course, to what extent do you actually can answer the question? Because I'm very interesting to say, like, is it really, like, I understand the dichotomy, right? Like in Africa, yeah, you should be more profit maximizing, but in maybe in the global north, not. You know, it could be like a shift, right? In the global north, everyone should be an impact startup. Well, in the global south, everyone should try to seek more.
that is a great and tough question. Ahmed, this is your fault. You've opened this up now. So. All right, we'll do another round. So folks, whoever I missed, and if you have some other questions. Oh, I was going to do another round. Don't worry. This is not going to be... So, honey, will get, so, firstly, great question around thinking about what is the misalignment between business and social, with good example of time. If 2 people want to just pick that up, and on that, you have the mic. Elizabeth, why don't you want to do that? And maybe Ola will go on those 2 ones. Around how do you sort of think about that long-term commitment to be able to do the right thing? Does short-termism, is that part of the problem? It's actually taking us down the wrong path. And maybe companies in the long run will have the natural incentives to do the right thing?
It's a tough question. And the reason I'm saying that is because it's not, in my experience, it has to be, there has to be ethical senior leadership to support and give a mandate to actually work on these sort of topics. So I had an incredible mentor who inspired me and encouraged me to challenge the status quo. And that enabled me to critically think about the issues that I was grappling with across the company. And that is a luxury. There, in Novartis, when I was working in the business, there was a board that would not look at any financial matters with any financial numbers and lenses, because they wanted to make decisions doing the right thing. And, you know, outside of that, you had to assess the impact financially of what it would cost to actually implement that. But the board itself made decisions based on what was good for the patient, what was good for what they thought was the right thing to do. And so those are the type of leaders that I want to work for. The challenge is, as you mentioned, this is based on individuals. This is based on impact-driven and passionate people, and I hope I can include myself as one of those. But some of those, the reason that I could work on that was a combination of factors and levers, which we talked about before. One being public commitments that are made, ambitious public commitments that we are held accountable for. Another one would be tying executive compensation towards social impact so that they are incentivized to support these sort of initiatives. There's one of I had the honor of training over hundreds of thousands of company employees to think more critically about bioethical challenges of the company. And by empowering them to reimagine their role and their professional profile as an individual, as a human being, we found that these ethical commitments were more upheld in the workplace.
So let's add that to our kitty of strategies to make this happen. Davos is a great place to do that, right? You've got CEOs running around. How do you put a camera in front of them and force them into a public commitment? And in fact, that is one of the many success stories that has come out of Davos over the last 20, 30 years has been these public commitments, and future CEOs have been unable to roll them back as a result. So it's a great example. I'm glad you brought it back. Ola, I'll also ask you on this one, because investors force the timelines often, right? So do you think with a long enough timeline, everyone kind of does the right thing? And then as an investor, you're looking to go in and then you're looking to get out. So how do you think that guides some of the decision making?
So since it's a small room, I can say this. I've never had a job.
I won't tell your mother.
Since I graduated from med school, I've always worked for myself, and I've had to pay people's salaries. And therefore, I've never been able to be in a situation where the work I do was not revenue producing. Because no matter how passionate my staff are, right, they live in Nigeria, I can't not pay them for 6 months and they'll still be like, oh, Ola, look, I'm focused on the mission. There's a limit to the mission. And that means sort of the way I spend my time and the way I think has to be about, somehow, it has to be about revenue generation. And I think, my husband, for instance, he works with KPMG. So obviously, like sometimes he was just focused on the mission. He doesn't have to, like it's a big company, right? They'll always pay him. So he didn't like have to directly think, okay, how is this way that I'm spending my time revenue generating? Because even if he was sick for 6 months, it doesn't really matter. They'll still pay him. I don't live that same kind of lifestyle. So I think it's not necessarily about whether it's a short-term or long-term thing. It's about your stage of development. And I think there was this really great article by Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore, and he said, that developing, like he was advising Singaporeans that when you're developing, don't look at the American soft life that they are living and think that you guys that are poor can live the same way. Like there has to be an element of initial work to reach a stage of development where you're a self-sustaining country. And I think that that's the stage where Africa is, where we need more ambition. We need to think bigger. We need less regulation to be able to like lead the world in some form of innovation. So I think in human nature, particularly in entrepreneurship, right, we're doing something very, very unnatural. We're doing something where the outcome is not sure. You're putting your life on hold for 10 years and you have no idea how it's going to turn out. The truth is your company might not get sold. The truth is the market might shift or regulation might shift and you might lose that 10 years and you might end up with nothing. And it doesn't matter who you are. I always say like entrepreneurship is no respecter of persons. It just, no matter what your qualifications are, you can still fail. And that's what the founders that we're supporting, are doing. They're putting their lives on hold with no salary or minimum salary for something that is not sure. And I think that entrepreneurship is the ultimate long-termism. I think being in business is the ultimate form of long-termism. We were not made, we didn't evolve to do this kind of, to do entrepreneurship. We evolved to have instant gratification. You do your work for a month and you get a commiserate outcome for the work that you did that month. Entrepreneurship is not like that. You're looking at the commiserate outcome maybe in 10, 15 years. So I do think that building great businesses that are profitable or have a route to profit is the ultimate long-termism. And doing that for your country, where like Africa can have at least 5, 10 Fortune 500 companies, is the ultimate long-term decision that we need to make in order to make our country and our continent sustainable.
I love that perspective. I'm going to argue with you afterwards about what happens when public markets enter, right? Yeah, I mean, I think you're dead on, but it's really interesting when public markets enter. I want to ask Ahmed and Akshay the second question, which is the definition. I love this question, right? Do we is it a social enterprise now because of the 2% CSR law? When you say a social enterprise, what do you actually mean as a philanthropy who is to think deeply about impact? So I think this definitional challenge of are we being too narrow? And I would just add to your great question, do sometimes, if someone is very successful, do we stop thinking that they're a social enterprise? Like, is there a success issue here? I mean, I think one of India's biggest companies, Amul, is a social enterprise. And it is the biggest, like, dairy company. I don't think anyone thinks of it as a social enterprise anymore. And so I wonder if there's a sort of an aspirations challenge. Ahmed, maybe starting with you.
So I think the definition challenge is something I don't think we can answer now, because even across this panel or even the audience here, we will all have our own framework of what defines a social enterprise and what not. And I think even with other terminologies when it comes to impact investing, venture philanthropy, etc., I think we need to come in as thinkers when it comes to thought leadership and actually define it in a way that everyone can understand it. And then what is the clear boundaries? Again, if it's successful, does it, as you said, do we stop calling it a social enterprise? Does the cause that made it start as a social enterprise become irrelevant when they make good margins? So I think it would be interesting from platforms like this in Davos to actually refine it over the years and then maybe test it out and stress test it with the entire, I would say, industry, whether it's the public and private, and then ultimately also define impact, which is, a lens that everyone looks at it in their own way. Is employability within this social enterprise a lens that we should be looking at? Is it the margins? Is it the issue it's solving? So I think, it's quite complex to answer now, Gaurav, but it would be interesting to see how can we collate, the understanding that we have from the different regions and the different, I would say, use cases, and then ultimately refine it into a guideline or a manual that we could actually start preaching to everyone.
And to make it relatable, as you first said. Akshay, what do you think?
I'm going to say something provocative, but
Do it.
as a thought experiment, what if we just abandoned the notion of a social enterprise entirely? And if you just thought of the world essentially as there's enterprises that are for profit, and then there's non-profits which make no money. I have often found it actually much easier to make sense of that world, and I think Ola's saying this in other ways, where there are many kinds of businesses that make money. There are businesses that are profit maximizing, and this is to Gaurav's point, where the leadership or whoever owns the shares, those people have an intent to do something. Like many people have an intent that all I want is to amass power and to amass wealth. And then there are leaders in every country who have the intent to build the nation or to help people. And I do think that there's been a little bit of a confusing narrative built because we were trying, I think, and this is my view entirely, no one else has said this, as a sector to try and align ourselves with and I think Ahmed said this, right, to not seeming like tree huggers, right? Like we started off very rooted in impact, saying we care about impact and outcomes and for a fairer world. And then the businesses didn't understand us. And then we started to create these vague definitions to kind of make business understand us better, which is a very odd thing to try and do. And we've lost ourselves sometimes along the way. But if we just said there's a community of people who care fundamentally about impact, sometimes they have to make money to scale their impact and sometimes they don't. I think it helps us to focus on what I think is most important, which is to remember that people have power. Right? The reason there's a 2% law in India is because we had incredibly high inequity. Companies were not spending to undo the damage that they were doing. And at some point in time, some elected representative, pressured by their people, passed a law. And I think now that that law has been passed, it's at 2% of profits. It could easily have been 10% of profits. There's a sword that hangs over every corporate leader's head. Because they know that if that doesn't change, at some point in time, some elected representative will push for that percentage to go up. And that's not good, to your question. What's the balance? I hope that doesn't happen because you don't want over-regulation. But at least it creates a little bit of a push and pull between, in India's case, billions of people who are getting nothing out of our development, and corporations and individuals who are becoming billionaires. And I think to forget that this is a battle, I think, is doing a disservice to the space. It'll always be a battle. And it'll always be, I think, the interest of people versus the interest of other people who are interested in power over those people. So I think to forget that we're in a struggle, I think, is doing a disservice to the question.
I just want to acknowledge you did win Social Entrepreneur of the Year award, and if you would like to give it back, I can facilitate this. But I really appreciate the provocation, and I realize also we've run out of time. Sahani, you want to just say your question out loud? Yeah.
And my question's changed every 2 minutes now. Holding this. But this question just made me think a little bit about structures. And if we had to really work towards impact, if that's the end goal, there are certain things to learn from corporates, right? Like the professionalism and the way that they have all these processes in place. And in the impact charity space, which is how you would divide that, there are other things that we're bringing to the table, which is actually how do you reach the people and how do you actually create that impact. Are there structures that you think, to be able to answer this question, that involve forms of collaboration between the two that can actually create that last mile magic?
And we are going to answer that in person afterwards because we have run out of time. I will just answer the one question that I was posed very quickly. I mean, I think that the challenge of a social enterprise isn't just about turning down certain types of work. And I will not publicly tell you what that is, but I will happily tell you afterwards. And it is hard. It is also other things. I mean, we're an open IP company. We do not believe that if someone has paid us to learn something, we should sell it to anybody else. We should give it to the world. And that's hard. I mean, of course, client data, no. But because that's the right thing to do. We often use... So that reduces margins. I mean, a huge amount of consulting is just kind of sell the same thing, right? And that's not our business model. So those are deliberate choices based on a code. And that means we accept, lower margin, and that's fine. So far, people seem happy. But it limits the amount of money we have for growth. And that is a trade-off, for sure. I really apologize. I let some of the questions go on too long, so I wasn't able to close this out properly, but I want to respect the next set of panels and so forth. I just want to thank this audience. I want to thank this fantastic, really lovely group of people. And it was a really, I think, at least great way for me to end my Davos journey. So thank you again, and thank you for listening. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.